As expected, UFC 5 is not only the sequel of UFC 4, but also takes a lot of the tools and the implementations and even the advancements from UFC 4 and implements them into this game, while of course adding a few gameplay elements, changing and even subtracting some gameplay elements, especially when it comes to the variety of strikes and most importantly submissions. And that's one of the bigger changes when it comes to this game is the implementation of submissions. Gone is the chase system with a meter where players would have to try to chase each opponent's designated icon color in hopes of pulling off a successful submission. Instead, this game focuses on meters. Each fighter has a submission meter associated with them when you try to attempt or counter a submission. And depending on your meter, how full it is and how much stamina you have, you'll be able to either execute or fail that submission. Instead of trying to chase or button mash, the player that's trying to execute the submission will have the option of trying to take that submission to the next level. And if the player that's on the defensive end is trying to get out of the submission, if their stamina and submission bar is high enough or higher than the person that's trying to execute the submission, they'll be able to counter the submission, stopping it, and even potentially getting into an advantageous position when on the ground. Now, you can string submissions together. You can actually transform submissions, say a triangle choke into an armbar, if your meters are high enough and the player that you're trying to submit doesn't counter you faster. And one new implementation in this one is actually foregoing the submission to get into an advantageous position. For example, if you have a guillotine choke, you can roll an opponent over and get into full mount instead of going for the next phase in the submission, which I think is a fantastic idea and a great way to add a level of strategy when it comes to the ground game that really, beyond that, is mostly unchanged. There's still the legacy controls that allows you to try to counter by holding the right trigger or the R2 button and flicking the right analog stick in the direction that the opponent is trying to escape or counter your potential advantageous position or mounted position or half guard or even full guard. The highly toted clinch system that was a big draw in the previous game returns here pretty much exactly the same, because since UFC 3, where they added head movement and more emphasis on footwork, the right analog stick is no longer associated with the takedowns. It is now associated with head movement, and once again the slipping avoidances that comes with being a fantastic stand-up fighter. It's still the foundation of being the best possible stand-up fighter you can be. But they have changed one thing that I will say does not feel good at all, and that is the implementation of spinning attacks. Instead of just having a spinning back fist or a spinning roundhouse kick in your repertoire, now spinning attacks actually are a setup where you have to do the spin and then hit either the strike or the kick button to pull off a spinning attack. So if you want to use a spinning back fist, you will have to hit the X and circle button if you're on the PlayStation 5. And then right after you do the spin, you have to hit the square button to throw the punch. It's very convoluted and very similar to the overall control scheme that is EA UFC 5 and going back to UFC 3. It is not the most intuitive and player-friendly control scheme that you would find. Even now, there's still a certain level of awkwardness when it comes to the positioning of certain attacks. Now, one of the biggest things about this game that goes beyond any of the EA UFC games and even the previous Undisputed games is the fact that this game is rated mature. And one of the main reasons for that is because this is one of the bloodiest MMA games you could ever find because of the new cut system. Thanks to them using the Frostbite engine, the graphics look phenomenal. And this allows for great detail on the potential of cuts that will occur during a fight on the fighters' faces. And this also ties into the fact that you can have doctor stoppages. Now, doctor stoppages are very, very rare, and there have been a few times when the doctors come in during a fight and they have looked at the cut and let the fight continue. So it's actually quite difficult to pull off a doctor stoppage, but if you can, it is a testament to how well you've been landing at a particular point on that fighter's face to open them up so badly that the doctor has to stop the fight. and very similar to the addition of leg kick TKOs from the previous game and more referee involvement in stopping fights. Doctor stoppages are one of those rare treats that can make any fight feel that much more exhilarating and rewarding depending on what side of the fence you're on. Now when it comes to modes, UFC 5 is very similar to the previous game, both offline and online. From an offline perspective, there's the prototypical fight now or exhibition options where you are able to play with any fighter on the roster and fight any other fighter on the roster as long as they're in the same weight class, or you can even mix and match like you did in UFC 4 where you condense certain weight classes together so you could have some monster fights between a middleweight and a heavyweight. A majority of the arenas and settings from the previous game return here, including the backyard and the kumite. The stand and bang options also return for exhibition purposes. There's also the event creator where you can create your own UFC event, create your own UFC fighter, even though a majority, if not all of the aesthetics and options are just like they were in the previous game, but you also have to give credit to the great facial sliders that allow you to make almost anyone that you want to make from a facial perspective. Though some of the bodies and even the tattoos that are unavailable make it kind of impossible to make your wildest dreams come true when it comes to a UFC fighter. The mix of offline and online hybrid mode is very similar to, say, what you see in the NRS games, the NetherRealm Studio games like Mortal Kombat and Injustice, and that is the fight contracts. The fight contracts are these timed-based challenges where you're able to take control of a particular fighter to face another fighter from an historic UFC event, and if you're able to overcome that fighter, you will get coins that you can use to buy things in the in-game shop. Now, you only have a limited amount of tries to actually win these fights, and depending on what fight you choose, it could be set at legendary difficulty or normal. So if you're not up for the task, you will get a free fight the first time. If you lose, you'll have to spend those same coins that you would have used for other items cosmetically in nature to buy the chance to fight this fight again. Career mode also returns in this version, and it's once again very similar to the previous one. After a rather bombastic opening where you start from the trenches of the backyards and try to become an amateur turned pro turned UFC superstar, you have a few cutscenes specifically with Valentina Shevchenko, and then it just goes into the routine of training and having a fight, training and having a fight, training and having a fight, with training options actually becoming automated if you're able to continue and get a grade of A on your workouts. So you don't have to actually do them anymore. You can just hit the simulate button and it will give you the same amount of experience and potential increase of your moves as it did in the previous game and as it would have if you actually played through the entire training session. One of the best aspects about career mode has always been the fact that you can prestige your moves. The more you utilize certain moves, certain counters, certain reversals, certain ground attacks, certain punches, certain kicks, it will upgrade those moves to the point that you become a vicious monster. And this ties into one of the biggest additions and actual returns to UFC 5's online offering, and that is online career mode. Very similar to EA UFC 2, online career mode allows you to create a fighter based on a specific weight class, be it women's bantamweight or heavyweight or middleweight or lightweight, and build that character up by fighting a variety of opponents who also have their own created fighters. And very similar to UFC 2, it doesn't feel like there are microtransactions to help the pay to win option of, say, buying evolution points so you can upgrade your character to have max stats and run through every online opponent who's trying to play legitimately. If you don't want to take part in fighting a bunch of created fighters, you can just go to ranked or even quick fight and play with UFC stars. In quick fight, you can play in any division that you want to, but in ranked, it is timed. So depending on when you play the game, it may be, say, heavyweight, lightweight, and women's bantamweight fighters are the only available fighters to play. And then after an hour, it switches to another set of divisions. So depending on what division you like the most, it may not be beneficial for you to play during a certain period of time online. To top it off, you have the potential of being matched up with people that are way higher, even in ranked. Blitz Battles also returns, which was the daily changing to a certain extent, test your luck style of UFC fights, where you would have, say, where one day all you could do was throw kicks, or the next day all you could do was ground attacks, takedowns, and submissions. Technically, the game is definitely rough around the edges from a gameplay perspective. A lot of the wonky physics that would pop up from time to time in UFC 4 is still here. There's also been issues in career mode when trying to learn specific moves, and the game for some reason not allowing you to do so. Where, say, you would try to learn a new submission, and instead of giving you that submission in your repertoire to learn it, as they had done in the previous game, it won't be there, so you'll spend an entire session trying to learn a move that you cannot actually utilize. As noted, the game looks fantastic, it sounds great. Thanks to this being a 9th generation exclusive game, we are given some extra pomp and circumstances when it comes to the entrances, the music, but the same level of promise that comes with the presentation isn't associated with the roster itself. A majority of UFC 5's roster is just what it was in UFC 4, minus people that are no longer with the UFC. There are very few new fighters associated with this game, which is one of the biggest draws of any sports game, where you get a new year, a new entry, and of course you get an updated roster. And unfortunately, a majority of this roster still feels either outdated or unnecessary, considering the roster that is currently active in the UFC. Of course, it takes a lot of time to build up fighters, to scan them, to make them as close to realistic as possible to their style. But there are so many omissions when it comes to newly ranked fighters, or up-and-coming fighters, or fighters that have been around for quite a while that aren't a part of the roster. Makes it feel even more underwhelming than it should have been, especially considering the fact that UFC 4 also had a very similar problem, where after about 6 months to a year after the release, the roster felt woefully outdated, and this one is coming out of the gate feeling just that way as well. And easily that is one of the biggest flaws when it comes to UFC 5. Even though they're promising that come December, come January, come February, they have a roadmap for implementing new fighters, for updating the roster, as they did with UFC 4. But it still feels like that this game was shortchanged when it comes to making sure that it felt like the most up-to-date roster possible. Overall, EA Sports UFC 5 is very similar to UFC 4. In reality, a lot of it is just UFC 4, just given a different coat, a few more extra fighters, a better look, some blood, some guts, some doctor stoppages, some new music, and the returning of Ultimate Team Mode with a different name. If you enjoyed UFC 4, you will definitely enjoy this, because this is just an extravagant, greater version of UFC 4 with the same bugs and issues that UFC 4 had even to the very end. But if you wanted more, if you wanted a better version across the board, from career mode, the offline modes, more arenas, more created character options, better online stability, then it's best to wait for this game to go on sale. There's really no reason for you to buy this game right now, other than the fact that if you want to go into the online scene and start when everyone else is. But if you're mostly an offline player, if you like career mode, if you like creating your own events and your own fighters for a big UFC mega show, if you're fine with an outdated roster, then wait for it to be on sale. There's no reason to pick it up right now if you're not strictly an online player. But if you are, as per the norm when it comes to these type of games, it's best to get in while you can before the competition gets way too high. But even with that, I still say if you can wait for it to be on sale, it's a better purchase in general than it would be at full price, especially if you already own UFC 4. But no matter if you get it while it's on sale or right now, there's no greater feeling than knocking out an opponent and becoming a UFC champion.
Show it. This is a very even match. Such a sneaky head kick. He did not recognize it was coming high.
Blocked that shot. Well, his opponent seemed to be stunned to a significant continues to sway with every huge shot being landed back and forth. What a fight! So how at 1 minute, 50 seconds of round number 2.
declaring the winner by TKO and still the undisputed UFC heavyweight champion of the world, Burrell